Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic, let's do it. What's a local urban legend or ghost story that's unique to your town? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. We had a library in town, now demolished, that everyone would go to during Halloween to see the crucified cat. I have no idea why anyone thought it'd be in there, or how the rumor got started, but it was basically a rite of passage to see it. But the library actually had a pretty legit security system. On the outside windows, there were either motion sensors or something that caused a super loud alarm to go off if you stood next to a window for however long, or put pressure on the glass, I think. This was 15 plus years ago. Regardless, you'd bring your friend or younger sibling to see it and tell them to look into the basement window. After a minute of trying to find it, a loud as F alarm would go off and scare the living shit out of them. Good times were had. The giant wild dog. I grew up in a small regional Australian town surrounded by bush, and there was always a story that there was a huge wild dog, or sometimes a pack of them, that would stalk people who walked up bush tracks. The accounts vary. Sometimes it was the size of a Great Dane, other times the size of a horse, or even a car if people were being extra. Never saw it myself, but I remember going up into the bush with my cousins as a kid, trying to spot it. I grew up in Ohio, and in the next county over, there used to be a home for children with spectacular name Gore Orphanage. If you've ever been on the Ohio Turnpike west of Cleveland, you'll see the sign for Gore Orphanage Road. Supposedly in the 19th or early 20th century, the orphanage caught fire one night. People rushed to get out, but many of the children who attempted to jump out of the windows were trapped by the bars on the windows that had been installed for safety. It was tragic and deadly, with children's screams carrying through the night while people tried to battle the blaze. Their spirits continue to rest uneasy, however. If you go to the site where the orphanage once stood, which is located in a rural, isolated area near Lake Erie, you can often hear the cries and moans of the children, still sounding after all these years. This typically happens at night. Generations of northern Ohio high school kids have driven out there, typically to scare the crap out of the girlfriends or just to smoke weed. The story is untrue, of course. The Gore family did run an orphanage for several years, but after a while, donations from local churches weren't enough to keep the home open, and eventually they moved away, and the large home sat empty. No fire, no death, no haunting at all. It's mainly the high school kids who kept the story alive because it just sounds cool. I live in Silicon Valley, which used to be all farmland. There's used to be a Toys R Us toy store on the land where a farmer died violently, and that store had a well-known poltergeist issue. It was a pretty famous feature of the store. When the British did a bunch of nuclear bombing tests out in Maralinga, they thought they cleared the areas of humans, but a bunch of first Australians were caught up in the testing. To hide what they had done, they gathered up everyone and hid them away in the catacombs of the Adelaide, and have rise of the mole people. The young lady of the highway. I remember this story from my grade school years, and people swore to it long after that. Near Greentown, Pennsylvania, there was a story of a young woman in a long green, no coincidence, cape, who would flag down highway travelers for a ride, always on a stormy, wintry night. She supposedly would ask them to drive to her parents' house, a remote and modest home near Newfoundland in northeastern Pennsylvania, and when the travelers would arrive there, she would somehow slip out of their car, leaving a wet puddle from ice or rain in the back seat. But once the travelers would get inside and meet or greet the elderly parents over a cup of tea, they would learn that the young woman had died at least a decade ago in a car crash or some such other tragedy on the highway. To refute the travelers' shock and disbelief, the elderly parents would open a cabinet and show as proof a dry and dusty old green cape that their late daughter had worn the night of her death. Grew up in a small rural village, and there was a story that dated from around the 16 or 1700s called the Witch of Winterslow. The legend goes that farmers hunting animals like hares or foxes would find that as their dogs were about to make a kill, a large white hare would suddenly appear out of nowhere and then lead the dogs astray. with neither the hunting dogs, their prey, nor the white hare ever being seen again. This happened so many times that the village began to run out of hunting dogs, and the local village vicar suspected that witchcraft was at play. So he fashioned a custom-made bullet forged out of a silver coin and joined a hunt, and when the white hare appeared, he shot it. The white hare was hit by the silver bullet, but was not killed outright, instead being mortally injured and jumping into the thicket and disappearing before the hunting party could catch up to it. When the hunting party returned to the back of the village, they found it in a state of drama, because a local lady called Lydia Shears had been found shot in her cottage and was bleeding out badly. The woman died as a barber surgeon attempted to extract the bullet from her, but as he did, it turned out to not only be the exact same bullet that the vicar had shot the magic hare with, but the lady had been shot in the exact same part of her body as the hare. After that day, there were no more appearances of the white hare, so people supposed that Lady Lydia was in fact the Witch of Winterslow, and that the white hare had been one of her transformations. You know, the thing I like about this is that you explained the lore and the history, and then you told the reality of it, which is good, because I guess every town has something like this, and you'll start to see some overlapping patterns in some of these stories, but enjoy. What's your town's favorite story? The Pedro Mountain Mummy in Wyoming. Some miners found a dwarf mummy in a cave. They were never really able to figure out what it was, an adult dwarf or maybe a child. It bounced around between scientists and carnival sideshows and disappeared sometime in the 60s. Local Native American lore talks of a race of little people. We had a man that would hide in the woods with a pillowcase on his head. I was in elementary school, and I just remember that we weren't allowed to play on the field near the woods for a couple of weeks. I even remember going trick-or-treating with my brother and sister and mom, and a police car pulled up to check out our costumes, and my mom and the cop talking about the pillowcase man. I remember the cop telling us not to worry about him, but then my mom and the cop talked about it for like 5 minutes while we walked to the next house. Maybe this is an urban legend in other towns, but the whole thing reminded me of an 80s horror movie. In the oldest cemetery in my town, there was a grave or statue that had quite the story behind it. The young lady died at age 21 in the late 1800s of a morphine overdose. The legend goes that she was engaged to a bad man and killed herself to escape having to marry him. After her death, he wanted the engagement ring back, but couldn't get it off her finger, so he cut off her finger in order to retrieve it. Her father had a statue of her likeness made and erected at her gravesite. Soon afterward, her ring finger broke off of the statue. Legend says that blood could be seen dripping from the broken-off finger, and that her ghost could be seen roaming the cemetery at night. While it is true that the young lady did overdose on morphine, it is suspected that it was an accident. Per her friend that was staying with her, she was intending to take a different, less potent pain medication and accidentally took morphine. She was never engaged, and the story about the engagement ring is entirely fabricated. It is true that the finger broke off of the statue, but that was probably just an accident or vandalism. The blood was red paint, another act of vandalism. In fact, after legends about her and her statue took off, the statue got further and further vandalized. By the time of my childhood, 90 years after her death, the entire top half of the statue was missing, leaving only her skirt. By the time I was an adult, it was gone altogether. As an added twist to the tale, her father did commit suicide a couple years later out of grief for her, as well as financial problems. He also used morphine. Local park is called Fanny on the Hill, not officially. The pub was named the same, but is closed now. Not named that at the time, obviously. Back when Dick Turpin was robbing carriages up Shooter's Hill, he was in a relationship with Fanny, who worked at the pub, possibly a prostitute. Travelers would stop at the pub on their journey, and she would use a mirror to signal to him if they had things worth stealing. When Dick was caught and hanged, she went to the park behind the pub and hung herself from the biggest tree at the top of the hill. Her ghost still scares people today. Now, this is the story I was told as a kid. I googled it as an adult and found nothing, so I posted in the local Facebook group. Several other people were told the same story, so why isn't it on the internet? In the 19-teens, 1914 I think, a woman from my hometown moved home from the city to take care of her mother. A man, who was a friend of hers, followed her. It's not clear if they were already romantically involved, but he had intention to propose. He packed up all of his possessions and money and showed up on the doorstep of her family's home. They welcomed him in and gave him a place to stay for the night. That night, he proposed and was rejected. He was enraged and slashed her throat with a straight razor. Then he fled into the night with nothing but the night clothes and his razor. The police tore apart the countryside looking for him. The village was on edge. At one point, the police chased a local teenager for hours because he matched the description. The kid had snuck out of the house in his nightshirt to steal a watermelon and believed that's why the police were pursuing him. This went on for several weeks, expanding into the rest of the county and beyond. A couple of weeks later, a local farmer noticed his horse was missing. He was checking a neighbor's fence line on the edge of the swampy hollow, thinking his horse had escaped to visit hers, when he found the decapitated corpse of the killer. He had cut his own throat with his razor the way through. The bugs and animals had done the rest. On the night of the murder, he had been lying dead no more than a few hundred yards from the scene of the crime for 2 weeks. We still call the sunken, swampy area Dead Man's Hollow. Okay, I'm from Colombia, and in the small city I live in, there's this urban legend called Los Ninos Dolce, or the Candy Sweet Kids. The legend says that there was an orphanage in a mountain many, many years ago that burned down, and all the kids died there. If you go at midnight in your car to that mountain with flour and candy, and you spread flour in the hood of your car, they put the candy on the hood as well. Get into the car and lock all the doors. You first will hear children lullabies, and you will feel as if someone is on top of the hood of your car. When all that passes, if you get out, you can see the imprint of hands and feet, children's size, in the flour, and some of the candies missing. The Screaming Tunnel, Niagara Falls, Ontario, originally built in the 1800s under the main line of the Grand Trunk Railroad, so farmers and cattle could bypass the tracks safely. It's said that the spirit of a girl who burned to death haunts the tunnel, and her screams can be heard echoing through it. David Cronenberg used the tunnel as a filming location for his 1983 film, The Dead Zone. Purple Aki. This guy has been a real-life boogeyman for about 3 decades. His name is Aikinwale, and my understanding is that he got the name Purple because he was so black he looked purple, but I don't know how true that is. He was obsessed with muscles and would make boys tense their biceps or do squats in front of them. He's been convicted for it, and as far as I know, he's still out there now. What? In Oceanside, California, there was a witch that lived alone in a decrepit house in a decent neighborhood. My older sister would always tell us about her when we were passing the street we lived on. One day she says, "You want to go to her house?" So we made the turn onto her street, and there she was, just standing and staring at her house. My sister freaked out and sped off as soon as we saw her. I went back a few years later, and I assumed she died because there was a completely new house built where her house was. I looked up to see what I could find about her. People would bother her and ding-dong ditch her too. I guess ever since her daughter died, she became a recluse and never liked when people visited her. I'm surprised no one has mentioned any of the famous Chicago hauntings. There's Resurrection Mary, the young woman who was seen on Archer Avenue hitchhiking from a ballroom. She gives Resurrection Cemetery as her address when picked up by Good Samaritans, and when arriving at the gates of the cemetery, she disappears out of their cars. Bachelor's Grove Cemetery with dozens of documented hauntings. The Eastland disaster. The Eastland rolled over in Chicago River with 2,500 employees of the Western Electric Company preparing to depart on a company excursion across Lake Michigan. Many of the 844 people who died were taken to a temporary morgue, which later became the studio for Oprah's television program. Tales of strange noises and ghost sightings abound. American Airlines Flight 191. In 1979, one of its engines dropped into the runway at O'Hare Airport. The craft rolled over and plowed into the ground, killing all 271 passengers and crew on board and 2 people on the ground. Residents of a nearby mobile home park reported numerous door knocks and many encounters with people who were asking where their luggage was or how to make their next connecting flight. There are more. Chicago has tons of spooky stories. Gravity Hill in Salt Lake City, Utah. I grew up in the city, and there were always stories of Gravity Hill behind the Capitol building. The story was that a girl was murdered at the bottom of the hill some time ago, and she tries to help people escape the same fate. Supposedly, if you cover the rear of your car in powder or something similar, and place your car in neutral when heading up a hill, your car will roll upwards instead of back down. After you get out of the area and inspect the rear of your car, you're supposed to see a set of handprints printed in the baby powder or whatever you used. I tried this once and didn't see any handprints. However, the rolling uphill instead of back down while on neutral actually did happen, which was wild as F to experience, to be honest. Southern New Jersey. We have the legend of the Jersey Devil. In the mid-1700s, Mother Leeds already had 12 children. After finding out she was pregnant again with her 13th child, she cursed this child and declared he would be the devil. The child looked normal at birth, but soon after transformed into a monster with hooves, bat wings, and a forked tail and goat's head. There have been many reported sightings. The funny thing is that the local Indians also had a legend of a similar creature that inhabited the area long before the Leeds family moved in. Bailey's Ghost Light. James Britt Bailey was an original Texas settler who got here from North Carolina before Stephen F. Austin came. His property is now known as Bailey's Prairie. He was said to be a real troublemaker, constantly getting into disputes and brawls. When he died of cholera in 1832, he demanded in his will to be buried standing straight up, facing west, with his jug of whiskey at his feet and his rifle at his side. Legend has it that the slaves that dug his grave stole his jug of whiskey, or in other versions, his wife took it away. Either way, he was deprived of his cherished beverage. Now, on cold, dark nights, a light can sometimes be seen out in the fields of Bailey's Prairie, said to be Old Britt looking for his stolen jug of whiskey. The light has been known to chase people in cars and will disappear as suddenly as it has appeared. There's a really good book called Ghosts Along the Brazos that was written by a local historian full of these small-town Texas folklore and stories.